manager took exception, claimed there was no such policy. Harding shot back and said an unwritten policy is just as strong as a written policy, and that their actions spoke louder than any words. And finally, Chili Walsh said, "We will give Kenny Washington a shot." Now, research, and I don't want to take anything away from Howie Harding because that was very impactful what he did, very important what he did, very significant what he did. But I've gotten a sense from reading some things that the Rams came in knowing that Kenny Washington could represent instant box office success for them. And so I think Chili Walsh had an idea that he was going to look into. I don't know how serious, but I think he had an idea that he was going to look into this idea of signing Kenny Washington, because he immediately hired a Southern California sports writer. And that sports writer over the years has told of actually having an early meeting with Washington to gauge his willingness to be that guy. And that they had an unwritten deal in place. And Washington was told, this was in mid-January of 1946, and Washington was told that the Rams wanted to keep it quiet until their staff had moved into LA in March. And Walsh and the staff got in like late in the day, particular day in March. And the next day, the very first news conference that the new Los Angeles Rams held was to announce the signing of Kenny Washington.
That's something. That is amazing. So tell my listeners what happens in the 3 years he's in the NFL. Because one thing that people, and I was shocked when I read this years ago, I didn't know that Kenny Washington still held the record for the longest run from scrimmage by a Ram player. I think 92 yards.
It to this day.
Yeah,
92 yards against the Chicago Cardinals in 47. Well, he signs. So his signing is announced in March, and in very major knee surgery. In one of his final games, and this is just such a tragedy, but in one of his final games with the Hollywood Bears, he suffers a significant injury to his left knee. So the Rams running through a medical, and they make the determination. The doctor says he's got to have this surgery. And, in 1946, knee surgery was very, very invasive. It's not what it is now. And a lot of guys they didn't come back from it. And so Kenny did not play very well in 46. He really didn't have the ability to do a lot of rehab before training camp began in July. And as one of the Rams executives said at the end of the season, we only got about 5 good minutes out of him all season long. And the Rams told him, Dan Reeves, the owner, sat him down after the season and said, "Listen, you're important to us. We want you, but we don't want the Kenny Washington that we saw in 1946. And if training camp in 47 ends and that's what we see, we have to agree that we're going to part ways." And Kenny said, if that's the case, I'll announce my retirement. He worked in the off season like nobody I've ever heard of before. I rode stationary bike every day, played handball with Bob Waterfield every day, trying to get his quickness back, hiked hills around Los Angeles every day.
Amazing.
He took up golf principally to walk 18 holes there when he could. So his rehab was just off the charts. And when he came back in 47, everybody agreed he was not the Kenny Washington with the Hollywood Bears or UCLA, but he was pretty close. He was not the guy from 46. He was really a much, much better athlete. And about 3/4 of the way through the season in 47, he was second in the league in rushing to Steve Van Buren of the Eagles. And in the game with the Cardinals, he had that 92-yard touchdown run, which to this day is still the Rams' record for the longest touchdown run from scrimmage. But late in that game, and he was the victim. People ask me, what was it like for him in the NFL? And I said, think of everything you've read and seen and heard about Jackie Robinson, all the abuse he took. Think of it in the context of a contact sport. The things that went on in the piles, the things that players did to him with late hits. So he got tackled late in that game with the Cardinals, and as it was depicted, almost all 11 defenders piled on top of him, and a couple of guys were maliciously twisting his legs, and he re-injured his knee. So he didn't play much the rest of the season, slipped back in the rushing totals. When he came back the following year in 48, he suffered a head injury in an inter-squad game. And then it was exacerbated exacerbated in their second game of the season in Detroit. He was kicked in the head and spent some time in the hospital. He struggled with a lot of nagging injuries throughout that season and decided at the end of the 48 season that he would retire from football. So what he did in the NFL was not the Kenny Washington with the Hollywood Bears or with UCLA, but that 47 season, he was pretty special.
Right, definitely was. And I want to ask you, because there's so much we could do this all day, but I want to ask you, my my thing is I've been working for a number of years now, and I have a site on Facebook, and I have on change.org a petition assigned to put Kenny Washington in the Pro Football Hall of Fame, which is in Canton, Ohio. He's in the College Football Hall of Fame, but he's not in Canton. And I have gotten into some arguments with folks over the years about that. And I just want your take on it, because a lot of people say, well, they'll say, well, he didn't play that long, or, and I always come back with, well, look, in the other sports hall of fames, like say in NHL, you have Willie O'Ree. He's in there. He only played one season of hockey in the NHL, but he's in there because he's a pioneer. He was the first Black player in the NHL. You have someone like Earl Lloyd. His stats weren't that great, but he was one of the first Black athletes in the NBA, along with Sweetwater Clifton. And so I use that argument as far as this is why Kenny Washington should be in Canton. And I want to know your take, Dan, on that.
No, I agree with you. And I think what you're doing is tremendous. And I hope that we can encourage people to jump on your petitions and get the numbers pumped up for this. I look at it a couple of ways. I can understand people saying, well, he played just 3 years in the NFL and really didn't do much. And so, statistically and all that, maybe not Hall of Fame worthy. And I can also understand those who would say, well, but if you put the focus on him as the pioneer, now you're disrespecting those guys, that were there in the late 20s, early 30s. And I can understand that. But listen, he did integrate the modern era of the NFL.
Right.
And I think that's very important what he did. The abuse that he took, it was not easy for him, what he went through in those 3 seasons with the Rams. And the other thing, which I won't belabor because I mentioned it earlier, is Kenny Washington's popularity. It tilled the ground for the success and the flourishment of the National Football League in California. You sit back and think the All-American Football Conference was starting at the same time the Rams moved to Los Angeles.
Right.
What if Kenny Washington had signed instead with the LA Dons? What would have happened to the Rams? Dan Reeves had put a deposit down on the Cotton Bowl in Dallas. He was up in the air about whether to go Dallas or Los Angeles. And I have to believe that Kenny Washington filling Gilmore Stadium week in and week out for the 3 seasons he played for the Hollywood Bears is what convinced Dan Reeves to choose Los Angeles over Dallas, which did not have a professional league.
Right.
So I think he's important in a great many ways. He's very important, in terms of being that pioneer and everything he went through to make it possible for guys. I mean, in his final season, finally the New York Giants and Detroit Lions saw the light, and they integrated in the 1948 season. And then George Taliaferro in 1949 was the first Black player chosen in the NFL draft. And Taliaferro said, I always said that if I got an opportunity in organized football, I was going to be like Kenny Washington. So he had a huge impact on other players that were coming up behind him. And I really do believe that just as the story has not been told before, in telling the story, I hope it will enlighten people to see the impact that Kenny Washington has had on professional football. And I think it's important to remember, too, that it is not the NFL Hall of Fame, it is the Professional Football Hall of Fame.
Right.
And that Pacific Coast Professional Football League was really good. I mean, you had Frankie Albert. You had a number of guys that went on to great pro careers. And there were a lot of top college players and even NFL players who thought, I'd much rather spend my winter playing in L.A. than in Green Bay, Detroit, or Chicago. So the talent, I think that has to be looked at, because I think the talent level in that league was very good. And if we're including guys' records in the All-America Football Conference or in the AFL in their candidacy, I would suggest that Kenny Washington's playing in the Pacific Coast Professional Football League should be included in his candidacy as well.
I agree. Amen. I agree with that. And I don't, excuse me, I don't know what else to say about that, but Mr. Thank you. And Dan, if first of all, what do you want? I mean, you've kind of mentioned everything, but what do you want readers to get out of the book?
Well, I want readers to come away finally recognizing the greatness of Kenny Washington. And when they talk about the greats of all time, either at the top of that list or very close to the top, I want the name of Kenny Washington to roll off the tongues of people. And I want what Kenny Washington went through in his life never to happen again. I mean, here's a guy that, this was a very emotional thing for me to work on, because you become very attached to the subject. And even my wife, in helping me in proofreading and editing, she became very attached to Kenny. And we would sit together and watch his movies. We purchased DVDs of his movies and watched them. And we became such great fans. Had a feeling of attachment. And you just feel such great sadness at what he went through and the denial. It's very heart tugging, and you hope that nobody ever goes through that again.
I agree with that. Yeah, that's my belief with him too. It's just, Kenny follows me around basically. I understand that. So Dan, how can anyone reach you if they want to talk to you further?
Well, I'm on social media. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Facebook. I'm on Twitter. My Twitter handle is @WritinGuy, WRITINGUY. So they can direct message me through any of those platforms, and I'll certainly get back to them and enjoy having conversation.
Well, I enjoyed this conversation. I could talk to you forever about this.
Well, I got nothing going, Greg. If you really have to shut it down, you got to shut it down. But I'm having fun with it.
Well, I got to get you back on about your other book, because about the baseball book, because we got to get you on there about that sometime.
That'll be fun.
So thank you again, Dan. I'll be talking to you later. Thank you so much. And again,
thanks for the invitation, Greg.
Thank you. And again, the book is Walking Alone. It's on Rowman and Littlefield Press, and Dan Taylor's the author. Great book. Get it. Learn about the life of Kenny Washington. Thank you so much, Dan.
A pleasure.
And I really enjoyed that interview, as you could tell, talking about Kenny Washington, one of my all-time favorites. And I'm going to play right now another Kenny, another favorite of mine. And this is Kenny Garrett, the great saxophone player. And I'm going to do a cut from his latest CD, Sounds from the Ancestors. I think I'll do, let's do It's Time to Come Home. It's definitely time to come home, as far as if you don't know anything about Kenny Washington. Time to come home and learn about it. So let's listen to that. Kenny Garrett on the Root and Root Show.